The most wanted drug lord in the world, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, led away by authorities after 6 months on the run.
Here's the poster just released, El Chapo now caught, but it came after a bloody shootout. And in the end, this is what he looked like when he was found.
The convicted Sinaloa cartel boss, who was responsible for 80% of Chicago's illegal drug trade, trying to do something that would convince a court he was wronged by U.S. prosecutors.
The internationally infamous cartel leader, El Chapo, has sent out an SOS to Mexico's president. But is there a more sinister meaning to his outcry? And why should the U.S. to Mexico border take note? Known as one of the most notorious, powerful, and richest drug traffickers in recent times, his incredible rags to riches story of escaping poverty to become a billionaire criminal kingpin seems almost too unbelievable to be true. El Chapo, whose real name is Joaquin Argibaldo Guzman Loera, was born in 1957 into a poor family in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. As a young boy, El Chapo's beginning involved growing up on a small cannabis farm, growing marijuana crops himself. From this, he had his entry into the criminal world of drugs. However, El Chapo had bigger ambitions than just subsistence farming. In his late teens, he started working for the nearby Guadalajara cartel, a powerful criminal group involved in drug trafficking and other organized crime activities across the rugged northwestern Mexico territories. El Chapo proved himself to be a smart and quick operator in the cartel. Despite his short 5'6" stature that earned him the nickname meaning Shorty, he also developed a name for himself during this time as El Rapido, speedy due to the speed at which he worked. He made his way up through the ranks thanks to a ruthless mindset and ability to get things done so quickly. By the late 1980s, El Chapo emerged as the head leader of the fearsome Sinaloa cartel, centered in his home region of Sinaloa, but with operations spreading all the way across Mexico and into the lucrative markets of the United States. Under his control, the Sinaloa cartel became one of the most well-known traffickers of drugs like cocaine, heroin, meth, and cannabis.
6 people are under arrest tonight after U.S. authorities discovered a drug tunnel between San Diego and Tijuana. The tunnel, the length of 6 football fields and 6 stories below ground, has rail tracks, ventilation, and electricity.
El Chapo oversaw the cartel's complex smuggling routes, transporting huge quantities of drugs across the long Mexico-U.S. border through inventive methods. This involved building underground tunnels, hiding product in ordinary vehicles with secret compartments, distributions by plane, boat, you name it. He also cultivated an army of hitmen to protect operations to continue the smooth running. The Sinaloa cartel's territorial wars with rivals grew, which left a trail of horrifying violence and tens of thousands dead. But the billions in profits also allowed El Chapo to indulge in a lavish billionaire's lifestyle, with multiple mansions, private jets, luxury cars, and everything he could imagine, including his infamous diamond-encrusted pistol, which was a huge difference from his poor start in life. However, with so much power also came infamy. El Chapo transformed into Mexico's most wanted fugitive as law enforcement from both Mexico and the United States intensified efforts to capture him. Other cartels were also taking notice and wanted an opportunity at the top. In 1993, the Tijuana cartel were after a chance to knock El Chapo from the top and take control. Following a tip-off that El Chapo was at the Guadalajara International Airport waiting for a flight, the gunmen opened fire on a car they believed El Chapo was hiding in. It was, however, a case of mistaken identity. They had attacked the wrong car. Inside the bullet holes-ridden car was the Archbishop and Cardinal of Guadalajara, Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, who was a high-profile religious figure, and with his death came outrage that spread across Mexico. The outrage caused El Chapo's status to change to a wanted man. He was made partly to blame for the Cardinal's murder. Shortly after this, he was captured trying to flee through Guatemala, and he was sent to the Federal Center for Social Rehabilitation No. 2. The sentence thrown at him was 20 years and 9 months. However, he was sure to make his prison time very comfortable. Despite the high security protocols, El Chapo's endless ability to buy off corrupt guards and officials soon became evident. He continued managing the Sinaloa cartel's operations from his cell, thanks to access to cell phones. He was even allowed to have girlfriends, mistresses, his wives, and alcohol snuck inside to keep him comfortable. Puente Grande was essentially just another luxury home for the spoiled boss to run the cartel from. With all the spare time, he was able to create new ways of smuggling and inevitably grow the cartel even stronger. In his comfy cell, with access to everything he needed and wanted, breaking out had never crossed his mind. until in 2001, when the Mexican Supreme Court ruled for a law to be created which would allow some Mexican prisoners to be extradited to the United States. After El Chapo had heard this, he was no doubt worried, so he began planning his escape as soon as possible. Just days after planning had started, he was ready. And in January 2001, El Chapo put his plan into action. With the correct bribes paid, he was able to escape by simply hiding in a laundry cart and was wheeled out to freedom. After his escape, El Chapo was on the run for over 13 years. During this time, he was able to run his cartel freely. He constantly moved between duplication safe houses and hideouts across Mexico, always one step ahead of the multi-billion-dollar military-led manhunt trying to track him down. He was also looking to gain control over crucial areas in northern Mexico that bordered with the US. The cartels fought over control, and with this, the drug war-related deaths grew hugely each year. And with this, the manhunt heated up. That nationwide manhunt finally achieved a win in 2014 when Mexican Marines successfully captured El Chapo at a beachside resort in Mazatlan following a firefight with his personal armed security team. He was promptly locked away at the federal maximum security prison in Altiplano, considered the most secure detention facility in all of Mexico. At the new prison, the Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1, which was highly restricted, his cell had no windows, a single bed with one shower and one toilet. He was not allowed to interact with any other inmates and was only allowed out for an hour a day. A far cry from what he was used to at his previous prison. The maximum security prison featured rigid security protocols like 24/7 camera cover, rotating guard details, full body screenings for visitors, metal detectors, and even sensors in place to detect any attempts at tunneling underneath the complex. No prisoner had ever broken out of this high security prison, until El Chapo, that is.
His arrest last year was heralded worldwide. He has now escaped from prison for a second time. Late last night, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman broke out of a maximum security prison about 60 miles from Mexico City.
In July 2015, El Chapo accomplished his most brazen, unbelievable prison escape yet.
This is the moment Joaquin El Chapo Guzman makes the Mexican government look ridiculous. Pacing up and down in his cell, calmly, waiting. These are the last images of Guzman before he makes the most daring escape in recent history. At one point, he appears to bend forward, focusing on something in the floor of the shower.
Somehow, he had managed to set up the construction of an elaborate mile-long tunnel shaft from a nearby construction site leading directly into the shower area of his isolated cell. On the night of his successful jailbreak, El Chapo simply pried open the entrance to the tunnel within his shower's blind spot, climbed down a ladder, jumped on a waiting motorcycle that was fixed to rails within the shaft, and zipped out to freedom over 30 feet underground before anyone even realized he was gone. The audacity and complexity of the tunnel's construction, complete with ventilation, lighting, and even a motorbike, left Mexican authorities shocked. It became clear El Chapo had to have had help from corrupt officials, engineers, and prison workers to pull off this feat from inside a supposed impenetrable supermax. El Chapo's legendary escape abilities showcased to both American and Mexican governments that no protocol would ever be enough to reliably detain such a crafty, rich man who was able to buy off any accomplices he liked with his extreme wealth and bribery skills. This escape, however, was short-lived compared to his previous time at large, and after only 6 months on the run, he was captured again back where it all started, in Sinaloa. Guzman was at a safe house in the coastal city of Los Mochis, which was under surveillance. That January 2016, a joint operation known as Operation Black Swan, carried out by U.S. Delta Force, U.S. Marshals, Mexican Navy Special Forces, and Mexican Marines took place, and this led to the final capture of El Chapo.
That image of Guzman in handcuffs, sitting on a bed, wearing a dirty shirt. The Mexican president tweeting, "Misión cumplida, mission accomplished, we have him."
So this time, rather than risking more repeated incidents, allowing El Chapo to flauntingly slip from custody again whenever he desired, Mexico made the tough decision to finally extradite him to the United States in January 2017 to finally face justice abroad, where he could potentially face far stricter prison time and hopefully less chance of tunneling or by simply riding a laundry cart to freedom. El Chapo was flown to the United States, where he was immediately admitted into the federal government's only supermax prison facility in Florence, Colorado, called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. This underground complex utilizes the strictest security protocols in all of America for isolating the most dangerous and high-risk inmates permanently.
I don't know what hell is, but I do know that the assumption would be for a free person, would be pretty close to it.
Within the supermax, El Chapo now spends 23 hours per day confined in extreme seclusion to a 12-foot concrete cell containing only a thin window, bunk, and toilet. Essentially zero amenities for staying occupied or comfortable. His remaining daily hour outside the cramped cell occurs within an indoor recreation room. He remains under 24-hour monitoring with no contact allowed with other inmates. Every single activity, movement, and privilege is heavily regimented and authorized solely by the prison staff. Access to basic items or communications are stripped down to much less often. Pre-approved time slots, only after intensive review. There is no way for him to conduct any business operations or receive any good treatment through bribes.
It is a sentence from which there is no escape and no return. This conviction is a victory for the American people who has suffered so long and so much while Guzman made billions pouring poison over our southern border.
The conditions of El Chapo's new underground cage at the ADX Supermax in Colorado enforces a strict system, completely stripping him of all luxury, privacy, contact, and has the ultimate form of psychological restraint upon such a formerly powerful, ingenious criminal mastermind. It's an extreme, torturous environment, crafted specifically to frustrate outliers like El Chapo, who are too resourceful and influential to risk even a slight chance of freedom or ability to try any escape plots ever again. Since his transfer into the ADX Supermax custody, El Chapo has repeatedly protested what he views as inhumane treatment and lack of basic privileges, everything from very limited outdoor activity time, bad prison meals, zero opportunity to make purchases, and barely any human contact, or apart from occasional pre-approved family calls and attorney visits, which are heavily monitored. But U.S. federal prison officials have remained firm in imposing the harshest prison conditions upon El Chapo. His track record for ingeniously planned and complex prison escapes leaves zero margin for mercy, because as soon as even the slightest freedoms are allowed, he could jump at any opportunity to try out his next escape, and that's a security breach Americans aren't willing to risk on their own soil. At age 65, El Chapo now spends his days in a repetitive routine, living the life of endlessly separated isolation within the most secure prison environment on the planet. A far cry from the luxury women, lavish parties, and unbound wealth he formerly enjoyed, despite the lawless bloodshed his decisions inflicted across North America and Mexico. His story showcases the extreme lengths required to deter up-and-coming criminals constantly tempting fate through tried and tested criminal enterprises that make huge profits across both sides of the US-Mexico border, no matter how tirelessly any law enforcement try. For now, the United States has employed the harshest extremes of modern human caging capabilities against the iconic figurehead representing the overall cartel crisis taking over America's southern border. But whether it stands to disrupt or simply to mix up the current cartel rankings, the region will remain unstable. So long there is a demand for drugs, the cartels, and their leaders, and in this case, El Chapo, will always be able to benefit. El Chapo's cry for help, shockingly, has not fallen on deaf ears. The Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has not ignored or denied his plea and remains publicly open to the idea. The Mexican foreign minister, however, is not so keen on the idea, given El Chapo's history of tunneling and hiding in laundry carts. The president's position could also be more than meets the eye, with the constantly rocky relationship between Mexico and the United States, and a lot of it can be traced back to the border. Why could this be? Let's take a deeper look at the history between the border and why El Chapo moving back to Mexico would affect this. The relationship between the United States and Mexico has long been marked by tensions over issues like immigration, trade, and security along their shared border. This troubled history dates back centuries, but certain actions taken by both nations in recent years have worsened the problems between them. The Trump administration from 2017 to 2021 took an extremely strict stance against immigration from Mexico that seriously damaged relations between the two countries. President Donald Trump routinely demonized Mexican immigrants as criminals, drug dealers, and worse, and made building a wall along the entire southern border a major point of his presidency.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be.
Despite heavy opposition from Mexico, Trump used billions in federal funds to construct new barriers covering hundreds of miles of the border in an attempt to halt illegal border crossings and drug smuggling. This increased militarization of the border fueled a humanitarian crisis, with reports of migrants being detained in overcrowded facilities where they lacked basic sanitation and were denied proper medical care. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy led to thousands of migrant children being separated from their parents and held in detention away from their families. Images of kids confined in cages created an outrage and brought global outcry against the U.S. immigration methods. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Trump administration in 2020 brought in a public health order called Title 42 that allowed border control to immediately turn away migrants at the border without letting them apply for asylum, something not normally allowed under American and international law. Over 1 million migrants were turned away under this policy before it was lifted in early 2023. Mexico also shares blame for the deteriorating relationship through its failure to combat powerful drug cartels that smuggle vast quantities of illegal substances across the border into American cities. Despite Mexico's government vowing to crack down on these criminal organizations like the Sinaloa cartel and Jalisco New Generation cartel, they remain in strong control. The steady flow of drugs fuels the addiction crisis taking over American communities, playing a major role in the ever-growing deaths recorded in the U.S. Mexico argues that the constant American demand is the root cause, driving the trafficking. While the U.S. has accused Mexico of not doing enough to take down major cartels responsible for waves of horrific violence within Mexico itself as they battle over key smuggling routes. Current Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has also criticized U.S. immigration policies, recently boycotting President Biden's 2023 Summit of the Americas over the exclusion of the authoritarian governments of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. So while Mexico and the United States have close economic ties and a shared cultural history, the relationship has been defined by mistrust, conflict, and tit-for-tat actions that have tended to make tensions worse rather than bring about peace. Unless both nations take a more diplomatic, cooperative route going forward, their troubled partnership could remain problematic into the future. Given the troublesome history, this could show why the president is open to the idea of bringing back El Chapo. Maybe just to spite the US, as the state of relations between the two nations is already in such a bad place. Even though he's currently serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison over in the United States, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman still commands incredible power and influence through his former Mexican drug cartel. The diminutive former leader of the Sinaloa cartel is potentially issuing a warning to American border troops. If he is not immediately extradited back to Mexico, his cartel will unleash an overwhelming flood of people, drugs, and violence across the US-Mexico border like nothing ever seen before. If so, US officials should take the threat seriously. While El Chapo has been locked away since his dramatic 2016 capture and extradition, the Sinaloa cartel's operations have continued nearly untouched under new leadership by his eldest sons. The cartel is known to have vast resources, criminal reach extending across the Western world, and a complex logistical network that could potentially mobilize forces capable of causing chaos and instability along the US southern border. Here are just a few ways in which El Chapo could rain chaos down on the border. Building a human stampede. Through its well-established human trafficking networks in Mexico, Central America, and beyond, the Sinaloa cartel would begin recruiting and transporting tens of thousands of migrants and refugees to staging areas near the US-Mexico border. These poor civilians would be offered a chance at a new life in America, or even just a few $100s in cash to take part in a mass movement towards the border. Utilizing social media campaigns, narratives of seeking asylum from danger and poverty, and age-old tactics of exploitation, the cartel could quickly assemble an on-the-ground force of thousands of migrants by promising opportunity in the US. For those refusing, the arms of the cartel could turn to threats against their families or outright abductions to bolster their human ranks. This overwhelming human surge comprising entire families with women and children, would be directed in multiple waves towards known crossing points and border cities like San Diego, El Paso, Laredo, and Brownsville. The goal, to utterly overwhelm and overrun the U.S. Border Patrol's facilities and enforcement capacities in a short period of time. Once this inevitable humanitarian crisis erupted, with images of border authorities being crushed by unstoppable human waves broadcast across the world, and the U.S. government would face immense pressure on what way they should deal with the constant wave after wave of people flooding the nation. The weapons escalation. But the human wave would be just the beginning. As border enforcement moved to confront and try to control the migrant flows, the next stage could begin. The introduction of weaponry into the crisis when armed cartel operatives mixed in among the migrant groups. The sudden escalation would shift the border crisis from a human wave into a full combat scenario, as these newly militia forces, using innocent migrants as human shields, opened fire on U.S. troops. Armored convoys would attempt to blast through ports of entry and cross-border defenses. Rocket attacks could even target Border Patrol aircraft, trying to monitor and contain the uprising. U.S. authorities would be forced into an unthinkable decision: unleash maximum force and firepower, inevitably causing massive civilian casualties, or begin retreating and holding control of parts of the U.S.-Mexico border to these hostile forces. Television cameras would broadcast every explosive moment of the unfolding chaos, violence, and death, inflaming domestic outrage, dividing U.S. political leadership, and severely straining the military's crisis response capabilities. Simultaneously, the Sinaloa cartel would ramp up its drug trafficking operations, moving unprecedented amounts of narcotics across whatever remaining open border areas they control. With border authorities focused on combating the crisis zones, they would aim to flood American cities and rural areas with fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, and worsening the nation's drug crisis. If U.S. authorities failed to regain full control along the border after a few weeks, the cartel's drug shipments could include more substantial terror weapons like vehicle-borne IEDs, anti-aircraft missiles to cause further chaos and undermine American national security. Checkmate: El Chapo's release. This would all put overwhelming pressure on the U.S. government to cut its losses and agree to his release and extradition back to Mexico to once again take control of his criminal empire. From there, he could use his remaining influence to call off the border campaign and push for calm to be restored in exchange for Mexican authorities, leaving him untouched. The longer the U.S. delayed or refused El Chapo's extradition demand, the worse the border crisis and threat against America's homeland would escalate. And even if El Chapo is killed or permanently locked away, the crisis could spiral beyond anyone's control, becoming a full-fledged narco-terrorist insurgency seeking to destabilize the American government. Of course, these scenarios represent an absolute worst-case situation, where the criminal forces are operating at peak capability. The likelihood of the cartels pulling off such a catastrophic, multi-phased attack are definitely far-fetched, to say the least. However, the combination of the Sinaloa organization's resources, cross-border human trafficking infrastructure, weaponry, proven ability to corrupt officials on both sides of the border, and El Chapo's still feared reputation within the Mexican underworld makes his border destabilization possibility worth taking note of with deadly seriousness. On its surface, El Chapo's call for extradition to Mexico could be viewed as a legitimate cry for help regarding his well-being and treatment within the notoriously harsh Supermax prison system in America. The conditions he now faces are extremely strict compared to his previously lavish lifestyle, leading the Sinaloa cartel's multi-billion-dollar criminal operations. So, from El Chapo's perspective, the Colorado Supermax potentially represents inhumane, torturous constraints, more like psychological torture than standard incarceration. It completely deprives him of any remaining influence, comforts, or ability to continue managing his criminal empire's activities through bribes and unlawful privileges as he formerly could buy in Mexico's notoriously corrupt prison system. Given these circumstances, there is a reasonable argument that El Chapo's desperate call to return to Mexico could stem from legitimate concerns over his standard human rights and well-being being severely violated by the so-called extreme protocols of the ADX Florence. If this psychological suffering persists long-term, it raises questions about potential cruel punishment violations of the Eighth Amendment. However, considering El Chapo's extensive history of extreme violence, wide-scale corruption, and repeated efforts to escape from Mexican prisons through bribes and tunnels. No matter the security protocols, his extradition demand must be viewed by American authorities as a likely ploy to simply resume his usual prison escapes activities again, rather than a legitimate plea over inhumane treatment. It was precisely El Chapo's ability to continuously undertake these escapes from Mexico's maximum security prisons through bribing officials that eventually led to his extradition to the United States criminal justice system in the first place. Despite being locked in Mexico's supposedly most secure facility in Altiplano, El Chapo still managed to plan and undertake the construction of an elaborate mile-long tunnel to break out of the complex in a daring escape. Given his incredible wealth, estimated in the billions, and far-reaching criminal influence, there is effectively no Mexican prison that could reliably contain El Chapo from continuing to oversee the Sinaloa cartel's expansive drug empire, trafficking narcotics into American cities and fueling addiction crises. This reality of being unable to stop such a powerful kingpin within Mexico's corrupt prison system was a major power behind his controversial extradition to the United States. So regardless of El Chapo's concerns over the Colorado Supermax conditions, potentially allowing human rights violations, American officials have a strong realistic and moral reasoning for imposing the harshest psychological restrictions upon him within the ADX Florence's most extreme isolation protocols. Their aim is to completely sever any remaining chance for the dangerous kingpin to potentially plan and take on any escapes, carry on his criminal activities, continue violence, or project power and corruption from within the U.S. prison system through bribery, as he proved capable of doing over and over again in Mexico.
Drug cartels in Mexico have been terrorizing Americans for decades. We're going to unleash the fury and might of the United States against these cartels.
Based on El Chapo's extensive history overseeing the violent Sinaloa cartel's operations that left tens of thousands of dead across Mexico, many would argue he has definitely lost any right to his own humane treatment while imprisoned. The billions he made from trafficking cocaine, heroin, meth, and other deadly drugs into American cities and rural areas over decades devastated communities and ruined countless lives through addiction and overdoses. Over 100,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2022 alone, many linked to the same narcotics trafficked by cartels like El Chapo's criminal empire. So, while international laws and human rights organizations promote for the maintaining of basic standards of dignity for all prisoners, regardless of their crimes, the moral debate rages over whether individuals like El Chapo should still be granted these considerations given the staggering scale of human suffering and casualties they ruthlessly caused in endlessly pursuing wealth and power through the illegal drug trade. The dilemma shows the larger, turbulent relationship between the United States and Mexico over border security, immigration issues, and the war on drugs. Should America take an even stricter, hard-line stance in aggressively defending its sovereignty and protecting its citizens from external criminal threats and narco-violence at all costs? Or does that one-sided militaristic approach run the risk of further worsening the very cycles of instability, lawlessness, and humanitarian crises it aims to quell along both sides of the border without any diplomatic resolution?
Where some of these suspected cartel gunmen from Mexico are firing their weapons towards our agents.
Indeed, El Chapo's own potential threat and ability to unleash potential waves of chaos, weaponry, and human floods across the US-Mexico border if his extradition demand is not met illustrates just how combustible and delicate the current border crisis situation remains due to lack of trust and cooperation between the nations. The volatile standoff evokes the same crucial tensions over economic policies, immigration enforcement, cartel violence, and border security that have defined the long-troubled US-Mexico relationship and continued the vicious cycles of conflict for decades. It remains an open ethical question whether extending human rights and humane treatment, even to criminal masterminds like El Chapo, could open new diplomatic avenues towards stabilizing both nations' mutual security and economic interests by finally controlling the lawlessness along the border, or if the United States government is indeed morally and pragmatically justified in taking absolutely whatever extreme legal measures are required, no matter how harsh or controversial, to fully neutralize the ability of powerful kingpins like El Chapo, to potentially project any further violence, drug addictions, and human suffering into American society, regardless of ethical constraints. As the brutal decades of cartel wars and unrelenting drug trafficking have shown, the border crisis has long since devolved into a harsh reality where human rights are often simply nothing but an ideal concealed by demands for straight-down-the-line common sense. His arrest and life sentence were celebrated as a major victory in the war on drugs. However, his imprisonment did little to slow the flow of illegal drugs into the United States and other countries. New leaders quickly filled the power vacuum, continuing the vicious cycle of violence and corruption. So, was locking up El Chapo for life in the ADX Supermax prison in Colorado the right move? The ADX is one of the most secure and restrictive prisons on Earth, with inmates kept in near total isolation for all hours of the day, -1. For El Chapo, these heavy-handed measures were seen as necessary to silence him and prevent any further running of the Sinaloa cartel from inside prison walls. But is such extreme punishment justified, or is it just cruel and inhumane treatment? Should El Chapo face the ADX's notoriously harsh conditions as punitive sentencing for his crimes? Or are the strict controls an unethical form of soundproofing to prevent him from communicating with the outside world? What do you think is the right approach? Is this the last we will hear from El Chapo? I think not.